Good morning and welcome to today's Coffee with Craig. This is where we here at the Firearms Policy Coalition try to give you something to talk about for the day. We try to talk about politics, culture, movies, you name it, all relating to firearms and the right to keep and bear arms. All of it right here on Coffee with Craig. So we appreciate you guys tuning in. Please make it a point to like and share this video feed so that your friends can join in the conversation. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, so that you can get the alerts whenever we go live. Also want to remind you, fbcgear.com, we've got brand new t-shirts there, ready and available for you to check out. All you got to do is go to fbcgear.com. Very, very cool t-shirt that we've got right now is the code is freespeech.com. That's code is freespeech.com. That's a very cool t-shirt that will let folks know that you have a First Amendment right to express your support for the Second Amendment. So please, if you want to pick that up as well as other very cool designs that we've just released, go to fbcgear.com. All right, let's get into today's topic. There's been a lot of talk in various social media circles, and you guys have been asking a lot of questions regarding DOJ showing up at people's homes. Now, we already know that DOJ knock and talks is not an uncommon thing, in regards to the APPS program. And there have been rumors that there have been, folks going door to door and actually doing inspections based on the bullet button registration. I really didn't want to get into discussing whether or not those are happening because I didn't want to get into talk about whether or not they are actually happening because there's nothing being reported in the media, in the mainstream media about it. And it would have been nice to at least have some of those reports to confirm. But anyway, all of that having been said, what I did want to do was I wanted to give you an opportunity to be able to know exactly what to do, right? I wanted you to have an idea of, should this be the case? Should law enforcement show up at your door desiring to see your firearms? Exactly how do you handle it? So with that, I wanted to invite a good friend of ours, of the Firearms Policy Coalition, of the Cal Guns Foundation, Mr. Adam Richards of Adam Richards Law Office. Adam, how are we doing today?
Doing great. Good to be here.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So I really appreciate you coming on because a lot of people want to ask me a lot of legal questions. And I always tell them I'm not an attorney, and most importantly, I'm not your attorney. So I figure the best thing to do is to bring someone on who actually knows what they're talking about. So what happens? I mean, what are some of the instances where law enforcement or the Department of Justice might come and knocking at your door to inspect your firearms?
So there's a number of scenarios where law enforcement may be unexpectedly at your door. Obviously, if someone calls the cops, someone in your home, well, you're going to get that knock and you might be going for a ride that night in those circumstances. But we're talking more about the ones that might generally affect gun owners who might be unwittingly targeted by law enforcement. And so the most common scenario I see in my daily practice, I get a lot of calls about it. And what happens is there is a list, and it's called the Armed Prohibited Persons System list. And oftentimes the state will receive notice, whether it's from the courts, law enforcement, CLETS orders, those are types of restraining orders, that someone is now prohibited from owning or possessing firearms and ammunition. And it can flow from a conviction, as I said, or also a restraining order. And the Department of Justice Bureau of Firearms, with a relatively bloated budget, has the resources to follow up on these leads where they have someone listed in APPS and they cross-reference that against AFS. And that's AFS, that's basically a list of firearms known to be owned or registered to a given person. Beginning in either 91 or 93, all handguns are registered to individuals in California. And beginning in January of 2014, all long guns are registered to individuals in California. So if you bought a long gun, whether it's a receiver, a full rifle, or whatever it is, after January 1st, 2014, that can be searched and cross-referenced with your name by serial number, make, model, etc. So law enforcement cross-references APPS, the prohibited persons list, with AFIS, the AFS system. And if they believe that someone currently owns a firearm who shouldn't, you get that knock on the door. And I'll get to what to do in a minute, but the problem arises in that the apps list is not perfect, far from it. And as I'll describe later, rarely, if ever, does law enforcement have a warrant in connection with one of these checks. They're doing the equivalent of the good old knock and talk. So they show up, and it's not just one officer. So for everybody out there who wants to try and prepare themselves for this possibility.
All right, folks, this is the real stuff. This is what you make sure you listen to this. Write it down. Get a pen. Make sure you guys get this.
Yeah, and we're not here to scare people, of course.
No.
This is not happening door to door, going down block by block. This is, percentage-wise, it's a low percentage of people, but it happens plenty for me because they all get funneled to me and a handful of other attorneys. Here's what it's going to look like. You may be home, you may not be, but someone's going to open that door, whether it's a family member or you, and they knock like they're there and they mean business. So you get that pound on the door, and you either look through that peephole, hopefully, or you open the door, and I'll tell you what I think you should do in a minute. And you're going to see anywhere from 5 to 10 officers out there. And they're not just in their standard dress blues. They're going to be in tactical gear, especially Department of Justice, Bureau of Firearms. They're going to have their full vests on, not typically armed with long guns, so they're not coming in to raid, per se.
Maybe the candy and flowers?
They don't have a box of candy for you, Craig, and they're not there to be real pleasant and nice. Sometimes they'll actually, though, because officers are trained to gain compliance from people. And so they might start with a more conciliatory tone. And so they might start by simply saying, hey, Mr. Jones, is that who you are? Hey, we're here. We have a few questions for you. And do you have any firearms in the house? And look, most of us, my generation, your generation, we were raised to be compliant, to be respectful, to answer questions, to not be difficult. And that's natural, especially for good law-abiding people. But as gun owners in California, you need to prepare yourself. Anytime a law enforcement officer is asking you a question, and you're not the one who called them there,
right,
you need to think long and hard about what you're gonna say and whether you're gonna say anything. So I'll get to my advice here in a minute, or at least my guidelines that someone might want to adhere to if this occurs. But they're gonna ask you questions. They wanna know, A, are there firearms in the home? B, are you aware of them? So if you've disclosed that they're there, obviously they know you had knowledge that they are there. Are they secured? Where are they? Is anybody else in the home? And they're going to ask for consent to come in. And unfortunately, they wouldn't be my clients if they had exercised their rights, but many people do grant consent, gratuitous consent for officers to come into their home, answer questions about what's in there, and it leads to problems.
You know, it's funny, my wife compared it to not that I want to compare law enforcement to vampires, but it's kind of like vampires. They really don't have any authority in your home unless they either have a warrant or you invite them in.
Right, and we'll talk about the warrant scenario in a minute. It's far less common than what I'm going to describe here. Let's paint a picture, and I want you to imagine yourself in this situation, you or any gun owner in California, because it can happen. And something I'll also get into in a moment, and I had already referenced, the app system is fraught with errors and mistakes, whether it's similar names that implicate someone else as prohibited, court systems that haven't updated the fact that you had a dismissed case, court systems that haven't updated that you had that restraining order dismissed, court systems that don't show that you had some other prohibition or disability dismissed, expunged, vacated, whatever it is. So you know you're allowed to own and possess firearms. But it's not what's important what you know, it's what's important that what the cops think. And so when they show up, here's my advice. You get that pound on the door. Me personally, I don't open the door in my home until I've identified who it is. I don't just open the door to see who it is. That's a safety issue, number one. And here it can protect you from potential legal troubles. Right. So first, for me, if you're one of those people, identify who it is. If you see a bunch of uniformed folks out there, guns, badges, tactical vests, body armor, I would address them through the door. Mm-hmm. And they're going to identify who they are. So you can say, excuse me, can I help you? You can say that through the door, your window, whatever it is. And they're going to say, yes, Department of Justice, Bureau of Firearms, along with whatever local sheriff, because they usually do a task force. You say, yeah, can I help you? You can ask what they're there for. You know, they might say, hey, your truck's on fire out front. You may want to assist them at that point. Right. But if they identify themselves and they say, we have a few questions for you, you can ask a follow-up and say, regarding what? Anytime anything comes up regarding firearms, especially in the state of California, you need to immediately at that point simply ask the officers, tell the officers that you're not going to answer any questions and that you don't have anything to say. And you can do it politely. You don't have to be a jerk about it. Just simply inform them that you're not going to answer any questions. And they may say, again, because they're trained to gain compliance, and they say, look, this is not a big deal. We just have a few questions. We got to make sure that, there's this firearm on a list that we had some questions about. It's not a big deal. Would you mind opening the door for us? You do not have to open the door. You can address them through the door and inform them that you are not going to answer any questions. And because in 95+% of these cases, they do not have a warrant, they do not have any further recourse to take. They may hang out for a while, hoping you're going to leave and they can address you out front and talk to you a little bit more directly. But that is a non-starter for them. This would quell nearly every case where the officer's doing one of these knock and talks. Now, if you get caught in a situation where you've now opened the door and you're face-to-face with them, or maybe even you're standing outside, the advice does not change as far as what to say. If they directly ask you or tell you that they have some questions regarding a gun, or they ask you, are there any guns in the home? Or, hey, do you know about that conviction you had 5 years ago? Do you know what the status of that was? Again, it's not your job to help them. It's not your job to talk yourself into either an arrest or a firearm seizure. And just politely inform them and say, officers, I know you're just doing your job, but I'm not going to answer any questions about anything regarding firearms or convictions. No matter what they tell you. Sometimes they'll browbeat you, sometimes they'll be nice, sometimes they'll be tough, and they say, look, you're making this a lot harder on yourself than it needs to be. Mm-hmm. Answer our questions, or we may have to go get a warrant. That's a trump card they often try and play. They say, well, you can answer our questions, or we're going to go get a warrant. My feeling on the subject is, I understand, officers, you do what you need to do, and I'm not going to answer any questions. Now, the problem that can arise is if you've left your home, you're outside, they may not let you back in. If they feel that they have probable cause, either because you disclose that there's a firearm there, or they feel there's an officer safety issue, they may say, okay, we understand, but we're not going to let you re-enter your home. We're going to lock the house down so nobody can enter or leave, trying to preserve this scene. And that can be a very difficult and stressful situation. I've had people call me in this circumstance, and I say, do not consent. They say, I can't go into my home. Do not consent. Sometimes people just break under the pressure of having cops essentially surrounding their home. And it's an exaggeration, not surrounding the home, but they're there with it locked down.
If they're not letting you in your house, they pretty much
and it's
down, right?
It is, and it's difficult. And unfortunately, the homeowner in that case put themselves in that situation to some extent. Mm-hmm. Take responsibility for exercising your rights and securing your home and asserting your right to privacy, and don't consent. Don't answer questions. Don't talk your way into an arrest. And even if you believe this isn't going to happen to me, I've never been convicted of a crime, or I was convicted of a crime, but my attorney got it reduced and I'm not a prohibited person. Don't try and explain that to the officers. Mm-hmm. Let me or someone else who's qualified to do it explain that to them, because they don't care. They're going to do their job as they see it laid out for them, and they're going to come in and they're going to do everything they can to remove those guns from the scene. Right. That is their dictate. That is their mandate. Right. That's what they want to do.
And their job largely is to do exactly what you just said, and they're going to let the district attorney and the courts settle it. Handle all the details and settle all that stuff. They were sent there to see if these firearms were there, and the more you give them to allow them to come into your home, the more of your rights you advocate. And I'm with you. I'm a big believer in law enforcement. I value the sacrifice and the risk they take every day, but I also know that they're there to do a job, and their job is not necessarily to protect my rights. And so it's my responsibility first and foremost to protect my rights.
Absolutely. And one thing I like to tell people, because they feel like they have to comply and answer questions, is law enforcement officers have unions. They have union lawyers, they have union representatives, and they have union guidelines and directives. And officers themselves are directed by their unions that if they're under investigation for something or they're being questioned, do not answer questions unless they have their representative or their attorney with them. Yep. So do the same thing the cops do.
Right.
Protect your rights and don't answer questions without counsel. And also, for those of you who, all of us, most of us, are great law-abiding citizens, we want to comply, we want to do everything we can to be lawful gun owners, would you bet your life on the fact that all your guns are configured lawfully as the law currently stands?
Especially in the state of California.
Yeah, with all the changes that have been going on, people just don't know, and it's not it's not their fault. It is so difficult. And so when you grant consent to come in, and it turns out later you're not prohibited, but now they've accessed your firearms and they find one that has a bullet button missing or loose, or a featureless rifle that has a muzzle device that, unbeknownst to you, actually qualifies as a flash suppressor under the very broad law. Well, now you've dodged the prohibited person in possession of a firearm, but now you're potentially being prosecuted for possession of an unregistered assault weapon or an assault weapon. So I have seen these scenarios many times. These aren't just hypotheticals. So that's another reason you have to be so careful. Even if you are a compliant person, you, quote, have nothing to hide. I kind of get tired of hearing that one. I got nothing to hide. I'll let the cops in. Well, you might be that one guy who has something that's not quite done right, and they take it. Or even if the officer thinks it's not lawful, it may eventually prove to be. Not all officers have the type of training necessary to truly identify in this changing state of the law whether something's lawfully configured or not. Mm-hmm. So that's my advice how to handle this. As far as reasons they might be there, we've identified a really common one where they think that you may be prohibited. Without getting into specifics, it's possible DOJ may respond in connection with the registration that you may have submitted concerning an assault weapon under the new regimen. So that may be another reason they're there, but the advice is the same.
Right. And
don't answer questions. Don't give them consent to search. Don't let them into your home.
Right. No, and I think that's the important part is one, the advice. The advice doesn't change. You know, the reality is that you need to first and foremost make sure that you preserve your rights. Even if you, like I said, even if you believe everything you're doing is above board and legal, you still need to make sure you preserve your rights. And then, you know, in the event that you wind up in one of these situations, I would also believe that you want to make sure that you at least know of an attorney that understands firearms law.
If you get a visit, whether it's for whatever it's for, you get a visit from law enforcement, you need to call an attorney. And you can contact Calguns Foundation. They may be able to refer you out to someone. I certainly field calls all the time for people in this exact scenario. So it's important that you speak with counsel, because once you've done the first thing correctly and asserted your rights and protected yourself, you need to find out exactly why they were there. And you need to clear that. And the Department of Justice does have a process by which you can clear your rap sheet, correct erroneous entries. It takes time. It's like pulling teeth to get them to do it. But eventually we will get your record corrected and restore your rights. Because if they're at your home and they believe you're prohibited and you're out on your way to the range, you get pulled over, you have firearms, you're potentially subject to arrest if they believe that you are not permitted to own or possess firearms or ammunition. So that's another consideration.
Yeah, and that's, I think you one of the other things to make sure you're on is it's a lot easier to address something like that instead of waiting until after they've either arrested you or confiscated your firearms.
Exactly.
Because we also know how difficult it is to get your firearms back once they've been confiscated.
Exactly. And one other thing, it's very uncommon, I'll briefly address it. In the event that officers show up to your home with a warrant, you obviously need to comply. If you don't comply with the dictate and face of the warrant, then you could potentially also be arrested for PC 148, resist, obstruct, delay an officer in the course and scope of his duties. So if they do have a warrant, they will clearly identify, we have a warrant either for your arrest or for search of the residence. And the warrant will describe on its face what they're permitted to search. You're not going to be able to, under those circumstances, parse out what they can and can't search. They're going to search what they think is within the scope of the warrant. An attorney down the road will determine whether their search exceeded the scope of that warrant. But here's the bottom line. If they have a warrant, you should still articulate that you don't consent to a search and that you're simply submitting to the warrant. You're not going to resist, obstruct, or delay them. Say, I don't consent to a search, but I am submitting to the warrant that you have. They're going to cuff you at this point. They may take you out of the house. They may put you on your living room sofa while they tear your house apart looking for things. This is an uncommon scenario, though. For the average person, this is not something that they even have to necessarily prepare for, but it's just good to have in mind and to understand what is happening out there. The circumstances where they may get a warrant, where there's particularized suspicion that you committed a crime and someone has either identified you specifically, or you may have a pending case, or may even be on probation. This is not what the knock and talks are concerning checking on prohibited persons.
So let me ask you this question. So let's say they come and they don't have a warrant. Can anyone who lives in the house give them permission to enter the house?
That's a good question, and it does implicate some somewhat complex areas of Fourth Amendment law as it's been as stare decisis has meted out that amendment over the course of our 200 plus years as a republic, the bottom line is this: if you have someone who is on the title or deed to that home, they reside there, they can consent to a search of the home.
Okay.
Now, if you do not consent, and the other person does, and you're both there, so you actually denied consent to search.
Right.
The other person says, "Well, I say you can." That's a stronger issue for you. But if you're not home and your wife says, "Sure, come on in, search," that is a problem. That is going to be a consensual search of anything in the home, unless you have something that's sectioned off that's clearly not accessible to the other resident who gave consent. So that's a very good point, Craig.
For example, let's say your roommate, who's not on the deed, not on the lease, or whatever it is, they're not the homeowner, or maybe a relative that's just staying there. Do they have the ability to give permission to search?
They do have the ability to give permission to search areas that are commonly accessible to them. Again, this is getting somewhat complex, and we want to take it on a case-by-case basis to see the exact facts and circumstances. But in a roommate situation, they can grant consent to an area that they have access to in the residence that, for example, would include all the common areas if there's a garage, but likely would not include your private bedroom. So if there's 2 bedrooms in the place and your roommate grants consent, that'll give them consent to search his bedroom, all the common areas, but likely there'll be an argument concerning a search of your private bedroom because your roommate is not entitled to access that area or use it.
Okay, because one of the things that I've done in my home, with my kids when they were staying with us, is they knew you do not have permission, do not give consent to anyone to come into or to search our home unless they have a warrant, and be respectful. Just like you said, all of the things that you're telling me that we should tell law enforcement, I've instructed them, as well as my wife. But I think that's something that's good to just let your family know. And I think it's good to let your kids know because you want your kids to know how important it is to preserve your rights and protect your rights.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most important things to take from this is that have that discussion with the members of your household, whether it's your significant other, your kids, especially if they're old enough to provide that kind of consent. I mean, I have a 4 and a 2-year-old. If they try and get consent from a 4-year-old, they're going to have problems with that search. But your significant other, again, because we're law-abiding folks and we're raised to be compliant and honest and straightforward and not be difficult, they may say, of course you can come in and search. And I've seen that also many times where they're taken by surprise and they say, well, why wouldn't I let these folks into my house?
Mm-hmm.
Have that talk with them and just be firm, be polite but firm. I know you're doing your job, but I'm not going to consent to a search of my residence.
So
that's the way to handle
it. As well as, once again, don't step outside. If you're talking, don't step outside of your residence either, because as you've already noted, they could then keep you from re-entering your home.
That's a possibility. I mean, on the other hand, that doesn't necessarily increase the chance of arrest. Just makes things potentially more difficult for you. I know some respected attorneys will actually advise people to step out of their home and close the door behind them to speak with the officers. I don't like that for part of the example I gave you where, well, at that point, they may not allow the person to re-enter if they suspect that there's a firearm in the home. So my suggestion is, A, don't open the door. If you are going to open it, you can talk to them through this partly open door. I don't like leaving the house and stepping out there and leaving the safety of the confines of your castle.
Excellent. Anything else in particular, just in regards to broadly relating to the subject that you'd like to share with our viewers?
I think we've covered it pretty well. I mean, it's hard when you're actually in the setting, when there's 5 or 10 guys there in uniform, and we're all taught in society that to respect uniforms, which we do, and it's okay to respect them, but it's not okay to submit to them at the expense of your rights. So I think we've covered that pretty well. Have the conviction as a citizen to assert yourself and protect yourself and know your rights.
And that's going to be it for today's Coffee with Craig. We very much appreciate you guys tuning in. We appreciate you guys liking and sharing these videos. Especially, please like and share this one so that your friends can be prepared to protect and defend their constitutional rights. Trust me, as I always say when it comes to our civil rights, if we do not use them, we will lose them. You guys take care.
If you like our videos, follow, subscribe, like, and share.